I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I come from what you might call a classic big family. Growing up, my family was always one of those that treated gatherings like a sport. Birthday parties, anniversaries, random Sunday lunches, you name it, we celebrated it. If someone sneezed too loudly, we probably threw a barbecue. That was the vibe. And for most of my life, I was in the thick of it. But somewhere along the way, things got complicated. It started small, as these things often do. Some disagreements here and there with my parents. Nothing major at first, just your typical arguments over life choices, how I was too independent or not traditional enough. My cousins chimed in now and then, making things worse, as cousins do. Then came the fallout over inheritance. My parents sold a piece of property, and I had the audacity to suggest that the proceeds should be split fairly between all their kids. Let's just say that didn't go over well. That conversation spiraled into accusations, yelling, and me being branded as the ungrateful one. From there, it was like a slow bleed. Invitations to family dinners started coming less often. Texts went unanswered. Eventually, I realized that my name was quietly missing from group chats where all the planning happened. It was subtle at first. I'd see photos on Facebook or Instagram of family events I hadn't even heard about. A part of me wanted to shrug it off, but it stung every time. It didn't help that I live in the same town as most of my family, so it's not like they had to go out of their way to include me. They just chose not to. I should have seen it coming, honestly. But the final nail in the coffin was the big reunion announcement. My family hadn't done a proper reunion in years, and when I saw the posts about it, I was actually excited for a second. A full weekend at a rented venue with everyone together again, uncles, aunts, cousins, even the distant relatives who usually only show up for funerals. It sounded great. Then I realized something. No one had invited me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I combed through my emails, checked my mailbox, scrolled through group chats, even the ones I'd been ghosted in. Nothing. The invite had gone out to literally everyone but me. I found out about the reunion because my cousin posted a screenshot of the event details in one of the family group chats. She even captioned it with something like, "Can't wait to see everyone." Everyone but me, apparently. I brought it up to a couple of people, my siblings mostly. They gave me these half-hearted excuses like, oh, it must have been an oversight, or I'm sure it wasn't personal. But the truth was pretty clear. I wasn't wanted there. Maybe it was because of the inheritance fight. Maybe it was because my parents still couldn't forgive me for standing up to them. Whatever the reason, I wasn't going to sit around and let them pretend I didn't exist. So I decided I'd go anyway. If they weren't going to invite me, I'd just show up. It wasn't like they could legally stop me from attending. It's not like it was at someone's private home. They'd rented out a banquet hall at a local resort. Besides, I'm still part of the family, even if they're trying to pretend otherwise. I started planning. If things got ugly, I'd leave and stay with my friend Dan, who lived nearby. I also ran the idea past my fiancée. She wasn't thrilled about it, to say the least. Her exact words were something along the lines of, "Do you really want to walk into a room full of people who clearly don't want you there?" She wasn't wrong, but at the same time, it felt like I had to do this. It wasn't about revenge, okay, maybe a little bit. It was about not letting them erase me. Leading up to the reunion, I couldn't help but obsess over the details. I scrolled through the family group chat more times than I care to admit, dissecting every post, every photo. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that my absence was a joke to some of them. There was this one comment from a cousin about how certain people couldn't handle family drama. I knew it was about me. I could feel it in my gut. As the date got closer, I started to waver. Maybe I shouldn't go. Maybe it'd just make things worse. But then I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to keep the peace, trying to fit in with a family that didn't seem to want me anymore. If this reunion was going to be the hill I died on, so be it. The day before the reunion, I packed a bag. My fiancée asked me one last time if I was sure about this. I told her I'd leave if things got out of hand. Deep down, though, I knew that walking out wasn't an option. If I left, it would just prove them right. They could pat themselves on the back and say, "See? He can't handle it." When the morning of the reunion arrived, I stood outside the venue, my heart pounding like a drum. I hadn't even walked in yet, but I could already feel the tension. This was it. I wasn't just crashing a party. I was walking straight into the lion's den. Update 1. The reunion was in full swing when I arrived. From the parking lot, I could already hear the low hum of chatter and the occasional burst of laughter. The venue was a large banquet hall with a glass entrance, and through the windows, I could see clusters of my family scattered across the room. Kids were running around, adults were holding plates stacked high with food, and everyone seemed comfortable. It was like a scene from a movie, except I wasn't part of it. I walked in, trying to look as casual as possible. The room was buzzing, and no one noticed me at first. I grabbed a drink from the refreshment table near the entrance, scanning the crowd for a familiar face. It didn't take long for someone to notice me, though. A cousin, let's call her Lisa, spotted me from across the room. Her eyes went wide, and she froze for a second before quickly turning and whispering to the group she was standing with. That's when I saw one of them peel off and head straight toward my parents. The ripple effect was almost immediate. Faces started turning toward me, conversations slowed, and the energy in the room shifted. A few people gave me polite nods or half smiles, but most just stared, unsure of what to do. My parents were across the room talking to some relatives, but I could see the moment the message reached them. My mom stiffened, and my dad turned to look directly at me. For a split second, I thought they might ignore me, but then they started making their way over. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I figured if I was going to do this, I might as well do it on my terms. I walked deeper into the room, past the appetizer table and into the main gathering area. Conversations were resuming now, but the mood was still tense. A few younger cousins waved or said hi as I passed, but most of the older relatives avoided eye contact. My parents intercepted me near the center of the room. My mom looked more shocked than angry, but my dad was already scowling. They didn't waste time asking why I was there. I stayed calm and told them I wasn't invited, but I had every right to be there. This wasn't some private, intimate event, it was a family reunion, and I was family whether they liked it or not. The tension was thick, and I could feel the eyes of half the room on us. My parents didn't yell, but their tone was sharp, accusing me of crashing the event and causing unnecessary drama. I pointed out the obvious: I wouldn't have needed to show up uninvited if I'd been treated like part of the family in the first place. The conversation started heating up, and I noticed my siblings nearby, watching but staying silent. One of my cousins, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, came up and whispered that they admired my guts for showing up. They said they agreed with me but couldn't get involved. I appreciated the support, even if it was quiet, but it only added to the feeling of being isolated in a room full of people who were supposed to be my family. The argument with my parents dragged on. Old grievances started surfacing, things that had nothing to do with the reunion. My dad brought up the inheritance dispute, claiming I'd disrespected the family by questioning their decisions. My mom chimed in, saying I'd been distant for years, as if that was entirely my fault. It felt like a laundry list of everything they thought I'd done wrong, and I realized they weren't just angry about today, they were angry about everything. In the middle of this, my fiancée arrived. She walked in quietly and spotted me almost immediately. She didn't join the argument but stayed nearby, watching and offering silent support. It was a relief to see her there, even if it didn't change the situation. At some point, my aunt, who'd always been one of my closest allies, pulled me aside. She didn't yell, but she made it clear she thought I'd made a mistake by coming. She said it wasn't worth the trouble, and that I should have just let it go. I told her I didn't have a choice. Staying away would have meant accepting that I didn't belong, and I wasn't ready to do that. The night kept escalating. My dad's voice got louder, and I could see people around us pretending not to listen while clearly eavesdropping. Finally, he accused me of showing up just to cause a scene, saying I wanted attention. That was my breaking point. I wasn't about to let him twist this into something it wasn't. I told him I didn't need their approval but walked away before things could get even worse. Outside, the air was cool, and the noise from the hall was muffled. I leaned against the wall, trying to collect myself. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from one of my cousins. They said they were sorry things went down like that, and that they wished they could have spoken up, but they didn't want to get dragged into the drama. I wasn't sure what to do next, stay or leave. Before I could decide, another relative came out. They didn't say much, just suggested it might be better if I left before things escalated further. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I appreciated their honesty. I stayed though. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. I headed back inside, determined to stick it out no matter how awkward or tense it got. Update 2. When I walked back into the banquet hall, it was clear things hadn't cooled down in my absence. The energy in the room felt different, tenser, quieter. People were gathered in smaller groups now, heads leaning in close as they whispered. I caught a few sideways glances in my direction, but no one said anything outright, at least not yet. I made my way to the food table, grabbing a plate to give myself something to do. As I piled on some appetizers, I couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversations around me. One group was discussing how certain people didn't know when to stay away. Another voice mentioned my name outright, followed by laughter. It was clear this wasn't just about me showing up uninvited. They'd been talking about me for a while, probably weeks. At one point, I passed by a table where a couple of cousins were sitting. One of them, the loud, opinionated type, made a comment loud enough for me to hear. Something about how some people just thrive on drama. It wasn't subtle. I stopped, looked directly at them, and they quickly looked away. It was frustrating, but I wasn't about to start another confrontation in the middle of the room. Then came the first real showdown. Another cousin, let's call him Justin, approached me near the drinks table. Justin's always been one of the more vocal supporters of my parents, and it didn't take him long to launch into a rant. He accused me of being selfish, of ruining the reunion, of making everything about me. The way he spoke, you'd think I'd crashed someone's wedding, not a family gathering. A small crowd started to form around us, everyone pretending not to watch while obviously listening in. I stayed calm, telling him I wasn't there to start trouble. But Justin wouldn't let it go. He brought up the inheritance drama from years ago, twisting the story to make it sound like I'd tried to rob my own parents. I corrected him, pointing out that I'd only ever asked for fairness, but it didn't matter. He was loud, angry, and determined to paint me as the villain. My parents, meanwhile, had retreated to the other side of the room. They weren't saying anything directly, but I noticed my mom shooting me pointed looks while my dad talked animatedly to a group of relatives. It was obvious they were steering clear of me while still making sure their side of the story was heard. Every so often, I'd catch a relative glancing my way after talking to my dad, their expression shifting to something colder. Even the family members who had whispered their support earlier were keeping their distance now. I couldn't really blame them. Justin's outburst had drawn a line in the sand, and no one wanted to get caught on the wrong side of it. Still, it stung. My siblings were nowhere to be found. I spotted them once or twice, but they made themselves scarce whenever I was nearby. It was like they decided the safest option was to stay neutral by staying invisible. These were the same siblings I'd grown up with, who I'd been close to for years. Seeing them avoid me like I was some kind of ticking time bomb was probably the hardest part of the whole night. My fiancée tried to convince me to leave. She'd been patient up until now, staying on the sidelines and letting me handle things my way. but it was clear she was uncomfortable. She said staying would only make things worse, and maybe she was right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving would be like admitting defeat. I told her I just needed a little more time. As the evening dragged on, the tension reached its breaking point. My dad made a passive-aggressive comment loud enough for me to hear, something about family gatherings being better when they're peaceful. I ignored it at first, but then he followed up with another dig, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore. We ended up having a heated exchange in front of half the room, rehashing old arguments that clearly weren't going to be resolved anytime soon. My mom tried to step in, but it was clear she wasn't trying to mediate, she was just trying to shut me down. By the time the argument fizzled out, I was exhausted. My fiancé pulled me aside and told me we should go. She was right. The night wasn't going to get any better, and staying longer would only give my parents more ammunition. I finally agreed, grabbing my things and heading for the door. As we left, I noticed a few people pulling out their phones. Sure enough, by the time I got home, social media was buzzing. Posts about the reunion had gone up, and while no one mentioned me by name, the comments made it clear they were talking about the drama. Some people were disappointed, others were laughing at the situation. It was humiliating. Later that night, a few cousins messaged me privately. They said they admired me for standing my ground, but they couldn't say anything publicly without causing more drama. I appreciated their words, but it didn't make up for the fact that the night had been a disaster. As I lay in bed, scrolling through the posts and replaying the evening in my head, I started to regret going. Maybe crashing the reunion wasn't the right move after all. But then I thought about how they'd tried to erase me, how they'd excluded me from something I had every right to be part of. That wasn't okay, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Still, one thing was clear, the fallout from tonight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Update 3. After the reunion, the fallout started almost immediately. By the next morning, I woke up to several missed calls and texts from people I hadn't heard from in months, mostly cousins and distant relatives. Some messages were vague, like crazy night, huh? Others jumped straight to the point. Why did you even show up if you weren't invited? It was clear word had spread fast, and opinions were already forming. It didn't take long for the family to split into two camps. On one side were the people who thought I had crossed a line by showing up uninvited, saying I had disrupted the reunion and caused unnecessary drama. On the other side were the quiet supporters, the ones who agreed with me but wouldn't say it out loud. A few cousins reached out privately, admitting they thought I was treated unfairly. One of them even confessed they skipped the reunion entirely because they didn't want to deal with the tension of knowing I wasn't invited. Meanwhile, my siblings stayed silent. I hadn't heard a word from any of them since the reunion, not even a simple text to ask if I was okay. It stung more than I wanted to admit. We used to be close, but now it felt like they didn't want to get involved in the family drama, even if it meant leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. I spotted one of my brothers commenting on a social media post about the reunion, laughing along with a cousin's joke about the uninvited guest. It wasn't directed at me, but it was hard not to read between the lines. My parents, on the other hand, were not staying quiet. I heard from several people that they had been telling their version of the story to anyone who would listen. According to them, I had shown up just to make a scene, stirring up trouble for attention. They conveniently left out the part where they excluded me in the first place. Their narrative seemed to be gaining traction too. A few relatives who used to be friendly started keeping their distance, not responding to my messages or giving me short, dismissive replies. Things got worse when a passive-aggressive post popped up on Facebook. One of my aunts who had been at the reunion wrote something along the lines of, "Family events should bring people together, not tear them apart." Some people just don't understand that. The comments section quickly filled with thinly veiled jabs about knowing your place and respecting boundaries. They didn't mention my name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Against my better judgment, I made a post of my own. I didn't call anyone out directly, but I wrote something like, "Funny how some people love to rewrite history when they're the ones who started the problem." It was vague, but it didn't take long for the drama to spill over. Relatives started arguing in the comments, and one even messaged me saying I should take the post down before things got worse. I ignored them. My fiancé wasn't thrilled with my decision to engage online. She told me I was only giving my family more fuel to twist the narrative. She suggested I block the toxic relatives and focus on moving forward, but it wasn't that simple. Every time I thought about letting it go, I remembered how they had tried to erase me from the reunion entirely. Letting it slide felt like letting them win. Then, out of nowhere, I got a private message from a distant relative, someone I'd barely spoken to over the years. They apologized for how I'd been treated and said they thought my parents were out of line. They weren't close enough to the situation to make a difference, but their message was a small reminder that not everyone in the family was against me. But just as I started feeling a bit better, I learned something that knocked the wind out of me. My aunt, the same one who used to be my biggest ally, had been talking behind my back. A cousin let it slip during a phone call, telling me my aunt thought I'd embarrassed myself by coming to the reunion and that my actions were childish. It hurt more than it should have. She'd been one of the few people I thought I could count on, but now it seemed even she had turned on me. After a few days of stewing, I decided to write a letter to my parents. I laid everything out, the hurt, the exclusion, the constant feeling of being the family outcast. I didn't hold back, but I also made it clear I wanted to find a way forward. I delivered the letter by hand, leaving it in their mailbox, but I didn't hear anything back. Frustrated by the silence, I tried reaching out to my siblings. I called each of them, one by one, asking why they hadn't said anything. The conversations were awkward and stilted. One of them admitted they didn't want to get involved, saying it was easier to stay neutral. Another outright avoided the question, changing the subject every time I brought it up. It was like talking to strangers. In the middle of all this, a younger cousin reached out. They told me they'd been feeling alienated from the family too and admired me for standing up for myself. They suggested we meet up to talk, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. At my fiance's urging, I booked a therapy session. I spent an hour unpacking the reunion, the fallout, and the years of resentment that had built up. The therapist encouraged me to think about boundaries and whether maintaining ties with certain family members was worth the pain. For the first time, I started seriously considering cutting off the toxic parts of my family for good. Update 4. Weeks after I delivered my letter to my parents, their response finally came, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of a thoughtful reply or even a phone call, they sent me a short email. The message wasn't kind. They accused me of making everything about myself, disrupting the family, and dragging up old issues that should have been left in the past. It felt like a slap in the face, but at this point, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the call I got later that week from one of my siblings. Out of the blue, they reached out, apologizing for staying silent during all the fallout. They admitted they had been afraid to take sides because of pressure from our parents. Apparently, my parents had been telling everyone to keep their distance from me, framing me as the one stirring up trouble. My siblings said they felt stuck, not wanting to upset anyone but also not agreeing with how things were being handled. That's when they dropped the bombshell. My parents' grudge against me wasn't just about the inheritance fight or my decision to stand up to them. It went deeper. Years ago, during a family financial dispute, my parents believed I'd acted selfishly and undermined them. This wasn't something they'd ever told me directly. I had no idea they were holding on to this resentment, and hearing it now felt like being blindsided by a truck. I pressed my sibling for details, but they didn't know much. All they could say was that it involved money, and that my parents had interpreted my actions as prioritizing myself over the family. I hung up the phone in shock, replaying every financial decision I'd made that could have caused this. Nothing came to mind that would justify years of tension. Determined to get answers, I reached out to a few extended family members who might know more. Most of them were vague, either genuinely clueless or unwilling to get involved. A couple confirmed bits and pieces of the story, enough to suggest there was some truth to it. One even admitted that my parents had been quietly nursing this grudge for years, using it as a reason to justify keeping me at arm's length. My fiance, as always, was my rock through this. She listened as I vented about the situation and encouraged me to confront my parents directly. She said it was time to stop playing the guessing game and demand some clarity. I knew she was right, but part of me hesitated. Confronting them could go one of two ways. It might bring closure, or it could blow everything up even further. Feeling overwhelmed, I made the mistake of taking my frustration to social media. I posted something cryptic about finding out the truth behind years of family drama and left it at that. Within hours, my inbox started filling up. Some relatives messaged me out of curiosity, asking what I'd discovered. Others sent not-so-subtle warnings to stop airing private matters online. Then came the backlash. One cousin who'd been quietly supportive until now turned on me completely. They called me out publicly, accusing me of stirring up drama and making things harder for everyone. It didn't take long to figure out that they'd been feeding information to my parents. The betrayal stung, but at this point, I wasn't surprised. It seemed like every time I thought I had someone in my corner, they flipped sides. I took all of this to my next therapy session, laying out the new revelations and trying to make sense of it all. My therapist pointed out that my parents' grudge likely wasn't just about the financial dispute. It was about years of built-up resentment and miscommunication. She encouraged me to focus on setting boundaries and deciding what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with them moving forward. After thinking it over, I decided to write another letter to my parents. This one was less about calling them out and more about finding a path forward. I acknowledged the hurt on both sides and expressed a genuine desire to move past the animosity. I didn't hold my breath for a positive response, but I knew I had to at least try. To my surprise, they replied fairly quickly. The tone of their email was cold, but they agreed to meet in person to talk. I was cautious but hopeful. This could be the start of something better, or it could be another disaster. Either way, I knew I had to go through with it. One of my siblings, the same one who'd reached out earlier, offered to mediate the meeting. They said they wanted to make sure things stayed civil and didn't spiral into another shouting match. I accepted their help, knowing it would be better to have someone there who could keep the conversation on track. I started preparing for the meeting, jotting down key points I wanted to bring up. I wanted to be clear about my perspective without letting emotions take over. My fiance helped me organize my thoughts, even role-playing some potential scenarios. She decided not to attend, reasoning that it was something I needed to handle on my own. The date for the meeting was set, and as it approached, I found myself equal parts nervous and ready. After years of tension, misunderstandings, and outright hostility, it was finally time to face my parents head-on. Whether it brought resolution or not, I knew one thing: I wasn't backing down. Update 5. The meeting with my parents was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, a quiet cafe just outside town. My sibling, who had volunteered to mediate, arrived first and grabbed a table in the corner. The atmosphere felt calm, but the tension was already brewing beneath the surface. My parents showed up a few minutes later, their expressions unreadable but serious. No one wasted time on small talk. We sat down, and the air between us was heavy. Once we ordered coffee, my sibling opened the conversation, keeping their tone measured. They started by reminding everyone why we were there: to talk, not to fight. My parents were the first to speak. My dad leaned forward, his tone clipped, as he brought up the financial dispute that had apparently started all of this. According to him, I'd acted selfishly by not supporting a decision they made years ago about selling a family asset. He claimed it wasn't just about money but about loyalty and respect. My mom chimed in, saying they'd felt dismissed and disrespected by the way I'd handled things back then. I listened carefully, letting them lay everything out. When they were finished, I explained my side. I told them that, at the time, I had no idea they'd interpreted my actions as selfish or disrespectful. To me, I'd simply been trying to offer a fair suggestion, but I never intended to undermine them. I pointed out that they'd never communicated their feelings to me directly, which left me in the dark about how much resentment had built up. My sibling nodded, backing me up, and pointed out that years of miscommunication had likely made things worse. The conversation went back and forth for a while, with my parents holding onto their frustration and me trying to address it without getting defensive. My sibling played an important role, stepping in whenever the discussion started veering off course. At one point, my dad admitted that while my actions had hurt them, they had also let their anger fester for too long, turning it into something much bigger than it needed to be. My mom agreed, though reluctantly, saying they'd probably handled things poorly by avoiding the issue instead of addressing it head-on. This was the breakthrough I hadn't expected. For the first time, it felt like we were finally getting somewhere. I apologized for any unintentional harm I'd caused, making it clear that my goal was never to alienate or disrespect them. But I also took the opportunity to set some boundaries. I told them that while I wanted to move forward, I wouldn't tolerate being excluded from family events or treated like an outsider again. If we were going to rebuild our relationship, it needed to be based on mutual respect. Their response was hesitant. My dad muttered an apology, but it lacked the weight I was hoping for. My mom nodded along, but her body language suggested she wasn't entirely ready to let go of her grievances. Still, they both agreed to try and keep the lines of communication open moving forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The meeting ended on a cautiously positive note. My sibling and I stayed behind for a few minutes after my parents left. They told me they were proud of how I handled the conversation and promised to help me navigate things with the rest of the family. Over the next few weeks, they became an unexpected ally, reaching out regularly to check in and even speaking up on my behalf in family group chats. As I worked on rebuilding trust with my parents, I also focused on strengthening my relationships with the supportive family members who had stuck by me. Some of my cousins reached out to meet for coffee or lunch, expressing their frustration with how things had been handled. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like I wasn't as isolated as I'd thought. At the same time, I let go of the relationships that weren't serving me. I unfollowed the toxic relatives on social media, refusing to engage with their passive-aggressive posts or comments. Instead, I started sharing positive updates about my life, pictures of my fiancé and me, milestones we'd achieved, and even little moments of joy. Reclaiming my narrative felt empowering, and it was clear from the messages I received that others noticed the change too. Therapy became a cornerstone of this new chapter. My sessions helped me understand how my family dynamics had shaped so many aspects of my life. I learned to focus on what I could control, my boundaries, my mental health, and my relationships with the people who truly cared about me. As part of this fresh start, my fiancé and I decided to create our own traditions. We began hosting small gatherings with friends and family members who genuinely supported us. These get-togethers were stress-free and filled with laughter, a stark contrast to the tense, obligation-driven events of my childhood. It felt good to celebrate with people who wanted to be there. My relationship with my parents remained fragile but functional. We exchanged the occasional text or phone call, and while things weren't perfect, they were better than before. I knew it would take time to fully repair the damage, but I was okay with that. For now, I was focused on moving forward, prioritizing my own happiness, and surrounding myself with people who valued and respected me. This wasn't the resolution I'd imagined at the start of all this, but it was enough. I didn't need the approval of my entire family to feel whole. I just needed to know that I'd done my part to make things right, and that moving forward, I was choosing peace over conflict. A new chapter had begun, and for the first time in years, it felt like I was finally writing my own story. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I'm here because I honestly don't know how to process what just happened with my family. I've been sitting with this for days, replaying everything in my head, wondering if I'm the crazy one or if things really are as messed up as they seem. After reading through countless posts like this, I decided I might as well share my story. Maybe someone out there will get it. To give some context, my family has always been a bit lopsided. I have a younger sister, Lisa, who's 23. Growing up, it was pretty clear who the favorite was. While I was expected to be responsible and independent from a young age, Lisa always seemed to get a pass. It wasn't outright stated, but it was there in the small things: who got scolded for missing curfew, who got an extra scoop of dessert, who got bailed out of every mistake. I told myself it was normal. Every family has its quirks, right? Fast forward to now. My 28th birthday was coming up, and I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I would have been happy with just a nice dinner together or even a heartfelt phone call. But a few days before my birthday, my mom casually mentioned that they couldn't do anything for me this year. Times were tough, she said. Money was tight. They had to focus on priorities. I told her it was fine and not to worry about it. I'm not a kid anymore. I don't need gifts to feel special. I tried to be understanding. Things happen. The day of my birthday came, and it was exactly as low-key as I expected. I got a generic card in the mail with a quick love, Mom and Dad scrawled inside. The family group chat lit up for all of 2 minutes with some half-hearted happy birthday messages, mostly from extended relatives. My parents didn't even call. I brushed it off. Maybe they were busy. It wasn't worth making a big deal over. A couple of days later, though, I was scrolling through social media when I saw something that stopped me cold. Lisa had posted a picture of a brand new car, a shiny red compact SUV with a bow on top. The caption read something like, "Thank you, Mom and Dad, for the best surprise ever. Love you guys so much." My stomach dropped. This wasn't some cheap used car. This was new. It had dealer plates and everything. I don't know what hit me harder, the car itself or the flood of memories it brought back. Over the years, Lisa has been showered with things like designer bags, trips abroad, and even help with her rent when she decided to move to an expensive city. Meanwhile, I was the one taking extra shifts at a fast food joint in high school to save up for college, the one who had to figure out student loans on my own. I wasn't resentful then. At least I didn't think I was. But seeing that car, just days after being told my parents couldn't afford to do anything for my birthday, felt like a punch in the gut. I texted my mom asking about it. I didn't even accuse her of anything, I just wanted to understand. Her reply was short. Lisa needed it for work. It's not the same as a birthday present. That was it. No explanation, no apology for how it might have looked, nothing. When I tried to press further, she brushed me off, saying I was being ungrateful and that I didn't know the whole story. I didn't respond after that. What was the point? Later that evening, I vented to my best friend about everything. He was furious on my behalf, saying I should have called my parents out right then and there. But what would that even accomplish? They've always had their excuses. I know how it would go. They'd twist it around, make me out to be the problem, and Lisa would act like the innocent victim. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the car. It was about a pattern, years of being treated like an afterthought, while Lisa got the world handed to her on a silver platter. For the first time, I started to really question things. Why was it always me making compromises, while Lisa got away with everything? Why did my parents think it was okay to prioritize her wants over my basic feelings? Was it because she was younger, more charming, easier to handle? Or was I just reading too much into it? Feeling stuck, I did what a lot of people seem to do in situations like this. I turned to Reddit. I laid it all out, trying to keep things as factual as possible, and hit post. The response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of favoritism and told me I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt. Some even suggested I go low contact with my parents, but that felt too extreme. I wasn't ready to burn bridges just yet. What I did know, though, was that I couldn't keep brushing things off. Something had to change. Reading through the comments, I started to feel a little less alone. A lot of people told me this wasn't normal, that I deserved better. And maybe they're right. I'm not sure what my next step is, but one thing is clear, I'm done pretending everything's fine. If my family won't take me seriously, then maybe it's time I make them. Update 1. A week after my birthday and the car fiasco, my parents invited me over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. They like to have these family bonding dinners every month or so. Normally I'd go smile and play along like everything was fine, but this time was different. After reading through the Reddit comments and thinking about how unfair everything had been, I decided it was time to stop pretending. If they wanted to have a family dinner, we were going to talk about how this family actually worked. I arrived on time, walking into the house to the smell of roast chicken and the sound of Lisa's laughter coming from the dining room. I hung up my jacket and headed in, stopping short when I saw her holding up a keychain with a tiny red car on it, showing it off like a trophy. My parents were beaming, listening to her talk about how great the car drove and how she'd already named it. The three of them barely noticed me until I sat down. The atmosphere was casual at first, small talk about work, the weather, and Lisa's new job. She was glowing, talking about how the car made everything so much easier and how she couldn't imagine commuting without it. My parents chimed in about how proud they were of her, how she was really starting to take responsibility for her life. The words stung more than I expected, but I stayed quiet for a while, letting the conversation roll on. I figured I'd wait until the right moment to bring it up. That moment came halfway through dinner, as Lisa leaned back and casually mentioned how she was thinking of upgrading the stereo system in the car. I set my fork down and cleared my throat. "So this car," I started, trying to keep my tone even, "when you said you couldn't afford anything for my birthday, was that before or after you decided to buy Lisa a brand new vehicle?" The room went silent. My dad looked up from his plate, eyebrows raised, while my mom's smile faltered. Lisa, of course, had no such hesitation. She smirked and leaned forward. "Well, I needed the car," she said. "You don't exactly need a birthday present, do you?" My mom jumped in quickly, like she was trying to diffuse the tension. She explained that Lisa's old car had broken down and she needed reliable transportation for her new job. It wasn't about playing favorites, it was about practicality. My dad nodded along, adding that they'd done what they thought was best for the family. I didn't let it go. I pointed out that while Lisa had been getting help for years, cars, trips, rent money, I'd been handling everything on my own since I turned 18. College bills, emergencies, I'd managed all of it without asking them for a dime. Was it really so unreasonable to expect a little acknowledgement on my birthday? That's when things started to spiral. My mom said I was overreacting, accusing me of turning something small into a big drama. My dad chimed in, saying it wasn't a competition and that I should be happy for Lisa. Lisa, meanwhile, sat there twirling her new keychain and throwing in the occasional comment about how jealousy isn't a good look. I couldn't hold back anymore. I brought up specific examples, like the time they paid for Lisa's spring break trip to Cancun while I worked overtime to afford textbooks, or how they covered her security deposit for her apartment while I had to scrape together my own. I wasn't trying to be petty, I just wanted them to see the pattern. But instead of listening, they doubled down. My dad accused me of making everything about myself, saying they'd helped me plenty over the years. My mom added that I needed to stop living in the past and focus on my own successes. Lisa, of course, couldn't resist one last dig, saying maybe I'd get a car too if I wasn't so uptight all the time. That was it for me. I stood up, thanked them for dinner, and left. I didn't slam the door or yell, I just walked out. As I drove home, I felt a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't just about the car or the birthday. It was about years of being treated like I mattered less, and I was done pretending it didn't hurt. When I got home, I called my best friend and told him everything. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen the favoritism firsthand over the years and had been telling me to set boundaries for a long time. My boyfriend agreed, saying I didn't need to keep putting myself in situations where I felt undervalued. The next day, I woke up to a string of texts from my mom. She said she was sorry if I felt hurt but insisted that they'd done what they thought was fair. She ended by saying, "Lisa just needed more help right now, and you're strong enough to handle things on your own." It felt like a backhanded compliment, and I didn't reply. Instead, I updated my Reddit post. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive, with many people sharing similar experiences and encouraging me to stand my ground. Some even suggested I go low contact or cut ties completely, though I wasn't sure I was ready for that. For now, I've decided to take a step back. I'm limiting contact with my parents and focusing on the people in my life who actually value me, but part of me can't help wondering if there's more to this story. The favoritism feels too calculated, too deliberate. I'm starting to think there's something bigger going on, and I'm determined to find out what it is. Update 2. A few weeks after the disastrous family dinner, I was starting to settle into my decision to limit contact with my parents. I'd muted the family group chat, ignored the occasional texts, and focused on my own life. Then, out of nowhere, my cousin Julia called me. Julia and I had always been close, but we didn't talk regularly, so it was a little unusual for her to reach out. I answered, curious, and she jumped right in. She told me she'd been following what had happened from the sidelines. Apparently, word about the dinner had spread to the extended family. Some relatives thought I was overreacting, while others were quietly supportive. Julia was firmly in the latter camp. She said she'd noticed the favoritism toward Lisa for years, even as a kid, and she wanted to share something that might shed light on the situation. According to Julia, my parents had a family trust fund set up years ago by our grandparents. The money was supposed to be split evenly between me and Lisa once we turned 18, with the understanding that it would help us with college, first homes, or emergencies. But Julia's mom, my aunt, had heard through the grapevine that my parents had been dipping into that fund for years, almost exclusively for Lisa's benefit. At first, I didn't know how to respond. Julia must have sensed my hesitation because she told me she had proof. A while back, she'd been chatting with Lisa during a family get-together when Lisa casually mentioned how lucky she was to have parents who always had her back financially. It was a throwaway comment, but it stuck with Julia. Over time, she pieced together bits of information from conversations and documents she'd seen at my parents' house. Eventually, she started snooping out of curiosity, she said, and found messages between my parents discussing large withdrawals from the trust fund, all for Lisa. Julia sent me screenshots of what she'd found. There were messages about paying Lisa's rent, covering her trips, and even one about the car. Seeing it in black and white made it all real. My parents had been using money that was supposed to be for both of us to bankroll Lisa's lifestyle, while I'd been scraping by on my own. I thanked Julia for telling me and spent the next day going through every email and document I could find from my parents. I remembered signing something when I was younger, something about the trust, but I hadn't paid much attention at the time. Now, I regretted not looking closer. I called a lawyer the next day to get advice. The lawyer was straightforward. If the trust was set up with the intention of being split equally, my parents couldn't legally favor one sibling over the other. She advised me to gather as much information as I could and start building a case. It wasn't about revenge, it was about getting what was rightfully mine. Things escalated quickly after that. Somehow, Lisa found out I was looking into the trust. She called me, furious, accusing me of being selfish and trying to take what was hers. She threw in a few digs about how I'd always been jealous of her, how I couldn't handle her success, and how I was grasping at straws to make myself feel important. I didn't argue with her, I just hung up. Not long after, my parents reached out. First, they tried to play innocent, saying I must have misunderstood the situation. When I didn't back down, they switched tactics, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart over material things. My dad went so far as to call me ungrateful, saying they'd sacrificed so much for me over the years. The lawyer's findings didn't help their case. After reviewing the trust documents and the messages Julia had provided, she confirmed that my parents had blatantly mishandled the funds. Not only had they favored Lisa, but they'd also used some of the money for personal expenses. It was worse than I'd thought. I updated my Reddit post to include everything I'd discovered so far. The response was overwhelming. People were horrified by my parents' actions, calling them toxic manipulators and urging me to take legal action. Some even shared similar stories of family favoritism, and their support gave me the push I needed to keep going. Meanwhile, my parents ramped up their guilt tripping. They left long voicemails about how disappointed they were in me, how I was ruining Christmas by stirring up drama, and how they'd only ever done what they thought was best for the family. Lisa, true to form, doubled down on social media, posting cryptic quotes about snakes in the grass and family betrayal. Through it all, I stayed firm. I started therapy to process not just the current situation, but also the years of resentment I'd been carrying. For the first time, I began to see how deeply my parents' favoritism had affected me, not just financially, but emotionally too. The support from Julia and a few other family members kept me going. One uncle even reached out, offering to help however he could. He'd had his own issues with my parents in the past and said he wasn't surprised by what I'd uncovered. Knowing I wasn't alone made all the difference. As for my parents, they're still trying to spin the narrative in their favor, but the cracks are starting to show. More relatives are finding out what they've done, and the tide seems to be turning. I don't know what's going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control of the situation. And something tells me this is only the beginning. Update 3. It didn't take long for things to hit a new low. About a week after I spoke with my lawyer and started digging into the trust fund situation, Julia sent me a text with a link to Lisa's social media. I opened it and saw a post that stopped me cold. Lisa had listed the car my parents had just bought her for sale. The caption reads something like, "Selling my baby to fund the vacation of my dreams. Message me if interested." I couldn't believe it. That car had been a gift, supposedly because she needed reliable transportation for work. Now she was trying to turn it into a quick payday for a luxury vacation? It felt like a slap in the face. I immediately saved the post and sent it to my lawyer, along with screenshots of the conversations about the trust fund. She advised me to hold on to everything as evidence and reminded me to let the legal process play out. But I wasn't done. I decided it was time to stop playing nice. I started reaching out to extended family, sharing what I'd learned about the trust fund and how my parents had been misusing it. Most of my relatives were shocked, especially when I told them about the car and Lisa's plans to sell it. A few of them admitted they'd noticed the favoritism over the years but hadn't wanted to get involved. Now, with everything out in the open, they were furious. Not everyone was on my side, though. A handful of relatives accused me of overreacting, saying that I should let it go and focus on my own success. They argued that the trust fund wasn't worth tearing the family apart over. My parents, of course, doubled down. When they heard I'd been talking to the rest of the family, they called me, accusing me of trying to humiliate them. My dad even tried to guilt trip me, saying I was ruining Lisa's reputation and that I'd regret it when I realized how much family matters. Lisa, meanwhile, took a different approach. She started posting cryptic messages on social media about toxic people and jealousy ruining relationships. She even went so far as to share a story about a friend who couldn't stand to see someone else happy, clearly trying to paint herself as the victim. Mutual friends and acquaintances started reaching out to me, asking what was going on. I told them the truth, sticking to the facts and letting them decide for themselves. Through all of this, therapy became my lifeline. My therapist helped me unpack the years of favoritism and the way my parents' actions had shaped my relationship with them and with myself. She pointed out that their behavior wasn't just about Lisa, it was also about control. By favoring Lisa and making me fend for myself, they'd kept me at arm's length while ensuring she stayed dependent on them. It was a cycle, and breaking it meant standing my ground, no matter how uncomfortable things got. The next big blow came when my parents gave me an ultimatum. They called me again, this time with a clear message. If I didn't drop the legal inquiry into the trust fund, I would be cut out of the family entirely. They claimed I was tearing the family apart over money and accused me of being greedy and ungrateful. I listened quietly, let them finish, and then calmly told them I wasn't backing down. If they wanted to cut me out, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to let them bully me into silence. That decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. My boyfriend was incredibly supportive, reminding me that I didn't have to tolerate toxic behavior just because it came from family. He even suggested that going no contact with my parents might be the healthiest option in the long run. I wasn't sure I was ready for that, but knowing he had my back made a world of difference. I updated my Reddit post again, sharing the latest developments. The response was overwhelming. People called me a hero for standing up to a toxic family system and encouraged me to keep fighting for what was right. Many shared their own stories of favoritism and betrayal, and their words gave me the strength to move forward. With my lawyer's help, I officially filed a claim regarding the trust fund. It wasn't just about the money, it was about holding my parents accountable for their actions. As expected, Lisa didn't take the news well. She started spreading lies about me to mutual friends and family, claiming I was making things up and out to destroy her life. Some people believed her, but many didn't. The evidence spoke for itself, and the more she lashed out, the worse she looked. The extended family continued to react in waves. Some relatives were horrified by what my parents had done and rallied behind me, while others stayed quiet or sided with my parents. The divide was growing, and it was clear there was no going back to how things were before. Then, just when I thought I'd seen it all, I got a letter in the mail. It was from my parents' lawyer, outlining their intention to countersue me for defamation and emotional distress. My lawyer wasn't worried, she said their case had no merit, but the letter was a clear sign that things were about to escalate even further. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Update 4. Not long after receiving the countersuit threat from my parents' lawyer, I sat down with my own attorney to figure out the next steps. She wasn't worried about their claims. This is a scare tactic, she said, laying out the likely goal, to pressure me into dropping my investigation into the trust fund. She assured me that my case was solid and suggested we double down on uncovering the financial details. Meanwhile, Lisa was keeping herself busy online. She posted yet another cryptic message on her social media about snakes in the grass and how some people can't stand to see others happy. She even shared a story about how family betrayal was the ultimate sin, accompanied by a glamorous selfie in her new designer sunglasses. It was obvious she was stirring the pot, and it worked. Mutual friends started messaging me, asking for my side of the story. I kept my responses brief, sticking to the facts. Then, an aunt reached out, offering to mediate between me and my parents. She thought this whole thing had gotten out of hand and wanted to help us find common ground. I knew her intentions were good, but I declined. There was no point in mediation when my parents refused to acknowledge what they'd done. The money wasn't the only issue, it was the years of blatant favoritism and manipulation. My lawyer and I pressed on with the financial audit. The audit turned up exactly what I suspected. Not only had my parents funneled a significant portion of the trust fund to Lisa over the years, but they'd also used the money for personal luxuries. One large withdrawal had gone toward a high-end kitchen renovation. Another was for a vacation to Europe my parents had taken a few years ago, which they'd claimed was a gift from a friend. The evidence kept piling up, and it was damning. When I shared the findings in my latest Reddit update, the response was overwhelming. People were furious on my behalf, with many suggesting I go to law enforcement. Some pointed out that this could qualify as fraud, depending on how the trust was structured. Others encouraged me to stay strong and not let my parents intimidate me. Their support kept me grounded as the situation grew more chaotic. Around this time, my parents started to panic. They began calling and texting, alternating between half-hearted apologies and subtle threats. My mom left a voicemail saying they were willing to talk if I was ready to put this behind us. My dad sent a long text about how this whole ordeal was tearing the family apart, and that I needed to think about the bigger picture. Neither of them admitted to any wrongdoing. They just wanted me to drop the case. I didn't respond. My lawyer advised me to keep all communication through legal channels moving forward, and I agreed. The only thing I told them was that I wouldn't consider reconciliation until they fully acknowledged their actions and repaid what they owed. Unsurprisingly, they didn't take that well. Lisa, of course, couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. She made another public post, this time directly referencing me. You can try all you want, but you'll never get a dime. Mom and Dad love me more anyway. I saved the post and sent it to my lawyer. It wasn't just petty, it was proof of her entitlement and my parents' clear favoritism. Despite everything, therapy was helping. I was starting to see the patterns in my parents' behavior and how their favoritism had shaped my self-esteem over the years. Breaking that cycle wasn't easy, but I was determined. My therapist reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. As more of the extended family learned about the trust fund fiasco, the division grew deeper. Several cousins reached out to show their support, saying they'd always suspected my parents favored Lisa, but hadn't realized how far it went. Others stayed quiet, likely unsure which side to take. My parents had always been good at maintaining their perfect family image, and this was shattering it. Then, the story leaked outside the family. A mutual friend posted something vague about parents playing favorites and getting caught, and it wasn't hard for people to connect the dots. Suddenly, people I hadn't spoken to in years were messaging me, asking if the rumors were true. I stuck to the facts, refusing to badmouth anyone, but the damage to my parents' reputation was done. Their carefully curated image was crumbling, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Amidst the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged. My uncle, someone I'd barely spoken to in years, reached out. He told me he'd experienced similar treatment from my parents when they were younger. They'd always been controlling and dismissive, and he wasn't surprised they'd pulled this with me. He offered both financial and emotional support, which I gratefully accepted. Knowing someone else had been through this made me feel less alone. Just when I thought I'd seen everything, my lawyer called with a bombshell. During the audit, she'd uncovered a major asset, a piece of property that was supposed to be in my name but had been illegally transferred to Lisa years ago. It was clear my parents had gone to great lengths to favor her, even at my expense. This revelation changes everything. The stakes are higher now, and I'm more determined than ever to see this through. I'll update when I have more. Update 5. The court date finally arrived, and as much as I thought I'd prepared myself, stepping into that courtroom made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. My lawyer was confident, armed with piles of evidence, bank statements, emails, and the trust documents that painted a clear picture of what my parents had done. On the other side of the room, my parents sat stiffly, whispering to each other. Lisa was there too, scrolling through her phone like none of this mattered. The first day was mostly procedural, setting the stage and outlining the case. It wasn't until the second day that things started to heat up. Lisa was called to testify, and her performance was something. She claimed she had no idea the funds were misused, insisting she thought all the money she received was simply gifts from generous parents who wanted to help her succeed. She talked about how hard her life had been lately, trying to frame herself as the victim in all this. My lawyer didn't let it slide. She presented text messages between Lisa and my parents discussing the trust fund and how they planned to use it. One message even mentioned transferring property into Lisa's name because she needed it more. Lisa's face turned bright red as the messages were read aloud. She stammered through her answers, trying to deflect blame, but the damage was done. Next, my parents were put on the stand. They stuck to their story that the funds were used in the best interest of the family. They downplayed the favoritism, claiming they'd helped me in other ways over the years. My lawyer, again, was ready. She showed receipts for the kitchen renovation and European vacation, directly tying the funds to personal luxuries. She also pointed out the glaring absence of similar financial support for me. The turning point came when my lawyer presented the illegally transferred property. She laid out a timeline showing how it had originally been in my name, only to be quietly shifted to Lisa without my knowledge. The judge was visibly unimpressed, especially when my parents tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. By the third day, word about the trial had spread. A few acquaintances who had once been close to my parents showed up to watch, their faces a mix of shock and disappointment as the evidence mounted. It was clear my parents' carefully curated image of a happy, supportive family was crumbling in front of them. Midway through the proceedings, my parents' lawyer approached mine with a settlement offer. They were willing to return a portion of the funds if I agreed to drop the case. My lawyer showed me the offer, but it was laughably low compared to what they'd taken, and there was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I rejected it without hesitation. The trial wrapped up with my lawyer delivering a powerful closing argument, summarizing the years of favoritism, the misuse of funds, and the blatant disregard for the trust's terms. She left no room for doubt. The verdict came quickly after that. The court ruled in my favor. I was awarded a substantial portion of the misused funds, as well as ownership of the illegally transferred property. The judge made it clear that my parents had acted in bad faith, and while there were no criminal charges, their reputation was in shambles. Lisa, predictably, didn't take it well. Within hours of the verdict, she posted a long, dramatic rant on social media about how I'd ruined her life and how money wasn't everything. She claimed I'd betrayed the family and warned others to watch their backs. It was hard not to laugh at the irony. My parents, on the other hand, went silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. They didn't even try to apologize or explain themselves. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to give it up. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding relationships with the family members who had supported me. Julia and I became closer than ever, and my uncle, who had stood by me through this mess, helped me navigate the next steps with the property and funds. Therapy also became a cornerstone of my healing. For years, I'd craved my parents' approval, but now I was learning to let that go. The biggest surprise came from my boyfriend. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, he proposed. He told me he admired my strength and couldn't imagine his life without me. It was the happiest moment I'd had in years, and it felt like the start of something new, something better. I made the final break with my parents shortly after. I blocked them and Lisa on all platforms and made it clear to mutual friends and relatives that I wasn't interested in reconciliation. This wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about protecting myself from people who had proven, time and again, that they didn't have my best interests at heart. I shared my final update on Reddit, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people commented, praising my resilience and determination. Many shared their own stories of family drama and thanked me for showing them it was okay to stand up for yourself, even against your own family. Looking back, I'm proud of how far I've come. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time, I feel free to live my life on my own terms, without the weight of my family's toxicity holding me back. This is my closure, and I'm ready for whatever comes next.